Hi, everyone. This is the Westfield Dialogue. We're back again with another discussion. This time we're talking about the recent Environmental Global Conference known as COP26, or more formally, the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, which is admittedly a bit more of a mouthful. The aim of these dialogue series is to have open and important discussions about global issues, but doing so in a way that is moderate and engages in meaningful dialogue without resorting to more incendiary or harsh tactics when it comes to talking about important issues. So for those of you that don't know what happened with COP26, the big picture is this. For many years and decades, of course, the world has known that climate change poses a whole host of threats to the world as we know it. And there have been a variety of attempts by governments, really since the 1970s or really 80s, to in some form or another address those issues. So for example, in the 1990s, then extending into the 2000s, there was what was known as the Kyoto Protocol, which was one of the perhaps first major international global accords focusing on the issue of climate change specifically. Then in 2015, there was a landmark series of negotiations encompassing well over 190 different nations that ended up arriving at what was known as the Paris Climate Accord. And that is the current major international global accord that focuses on the issue of climate change, but also other environmental issues as well, as we'll chat about in this dialogue. And what happened in this sort of last year in 2021, specifically from October through November, a large number of leaders and business people from around the world convened in Glasgow to talk about a lot of the issues the world is facing, as well as the progress that has thus far been made with the Paris Climate Accord, and to sort of convene as a global community, talk about where we're currently at. So that is the sort of background in terms of where we got to how we are currently in our current position and what COP26 was. Now, COP26 had lots of different components and lots of different issues were talked about, but one of the major things that was discussed and sort of roundtabled at the conference was the issue of deforestation, which is obviously a particularly important issue in lots of areas of the world where there are vital ecosystems that have a lot of forestry, like, for example, the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. So, Eira, what sort of happened, generally speaking, when it came to how COP26 approached the issue of deforestation and what sort of progress was made?
Yeah, so starting off with a little bit of history, in the Paris Climate Accord, there was a huge part that was about like fighting deforestation. There were financial incentives for both countries and businesses to preserve forests, do things like that. But what we've seen is that in these past like 5 to 6 years, we've seen a lot of loss of forests still. In 2018, forest loss represented 8% of total global carbon emissions. And we all know that like the Amazon rainforest, large parts of it were burnt down by Brazil for various reasons. So clearly the part of the Paris Climate Accord for deforestation didn't necessarily work. So at this recent conference, we've had more countries, 141 countries, pledged to do 6 main things for land protection. And those things were things like conserving forests, but also facilitating trade that didn't rely on like land degradation, and implementing agricultural policies that are more helpful to the environment. A really interesting part of this was that all countries vowed to protect their indigenous people's rights while they were doing this. So they were going to work with the tribes, work with the indigenous people that are in their country to create a more sustainable, better like environment within agriculture and preserving forests as a whole. So these countries cover about 85% of the world's forests as of right now. And we've also seen that other endorsers have, like other businesses and things, have endorsed saving forests as well. So there have been new endorsements in places such as Singapore and Turkmenistan. So overall, we have 91% of the world's forests being preserved, covered by like endorsers that are different countries and things like that. So as for the future, it's going in the right direction. There are stricter restrictions overall in terms of protecting forests. The main issue that we see is sort of like in the policies and the nuances of these policies in terms of like donating money, who's going to ensure like what the money is being used for, which country is allowed to police like how their forests are being run. Is it different countries looking at it, or is it going to be that country taking charge? So this is sort of like what it's looking like for the future, but there have been bigger advancements than we've seen before in terms of both deforestation and just land protection as a whole.
Very interesting. That's very interesting progress that's been made, and some other issues that need to be sort of focused on in the future. Marcus, obviously, there's one part of the COP26 that focused on deforestation and other similar sorts of issues, but what specifically happened at COP26 in regards to coal, and perhaps the focus more so on emissions coming from things like fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, so coal, I know we sometimes sort of think of it as sort of an old-fashioned form of power, but it does still, both in the US and also in a lot of other countries, play a really large role in power generation. And so it's of particular concern with trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. So UK was the country that was leading the COP26 this year. And on November 3rd, they announced that 190 countries and organizations had committed to phasing out coal power in the 2030s and the 2040s. Now, first off, just a side comment here, like as someone who's done Model UN, I find it very impressive that 190 countries could agree on anything, let alone something as sometimes controversial as phasing out of coal power. And another additional factor was that 23 of the countries who signed it, for them, there was 23 countries that it was their first time that they'd committed to anything like this. Some of those were Poland and Ukraine and Vietnam. And they also sort of rely a lot on coal and have been hesitant in the past and expressed hesitation to sign something like this. One thing was that there was China, Japan, and India, and the United States, which we'll talk more about them later, but they did not sign this particular one, which is disappointing because they use a lot of coal, but they also drew up their own joint agreement, or the US and China did, and they had recommitted to a previous pledge to move away from international support for coal use, and China in particular committed to phasing down coal consumption between 2021 and 2026. And so that's sort of where things stand with regard to that. Although it's also worth mentioning that the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States, Germany, and France, they also announced during this conference that they're going to be committing $8.5 billion in financing over the next 5 years to assist South Africa with regard to their transition away from coal. And South Africa is one of the most dependent countries, or one of the countries that depends the most on coal. So hopefully that seems to be a big thing that is being considered, fortunately, that some countries' economies are extremely dependent on coal. And so it's unfair to just ask them to move away entirely on their own. So it's good to hear that there's at least being something done in terms of larger countries with the resources trying to finance other countries move away from this kind of fossil fuel generation. One other thing to mention that was a bit unique about this is I believe in the research that I did that this is the first time in any of these COP conferences that they've actually explicitly in the final resolution mentioned specific fossil fuels like coal. So getting to that point where we're now kind of actually recognizing with language the things that are causing these problems is a lot of people say that's a really big step here.
Yeah, for sure. So it obviously seems like, especially on issues like coal and deforestation, there's been a lot of at least positive movement, at least in terms of rhetoric, but also in terms of climate finance, which was also something that was originally discussed way back in 2015 with the original Paris Climate Accord, where there had initially been a plan to more or less provide $100 billion annually to developing economies to allow them to adapt to and sort of mitigate the effects of climate change, which ended up not materializing because a lot of more sort of large scale economies failed to contribute enough money. But there's now increasingly a push both within the public and private sector towards increased financing for green sorts of issues, like you sort of mentioned, Marcus. But I'm kind of interested, especially Bodhi, what you sort of have read about or heard in regards to, obviously COP26 put a lot of momentum behind some issues pertaining to climate change, but there's a lot of countries that aren't necessarily all on board with the idea that we have to do everything now and fix the climate at this particular moment. So what have some countries been saying along those lines?
Yeah, so in general, I think one of like the main parties that have been affected by that were these like kind of small developing countries. And I stress small because a lot of them are kind of island nations or ones that are like usually like neglected in a lot of these conferences or just kind of international issues. So we saw that within COP26, there were a lot of grants and things that were being discussed. But in the final hours of the conference, there was really nothing that materialized, kind of similar to the Paris Climate Agreement. But in the Paris Climate Agreement, there was actually something that was decided upon. And actually within COP26, there was really only this kind of $40 billion pledge that was made by some wealthy parties. But a lot of parties and countries are speculating that this is actually not going to happen. And it's kind of just, you know, a placeholder so that these countries can say that they're helping. We do know that before the Paris Climate Agreement, just for some background, the Green Climate Fund, which was in 2010, pledged for $10 billion. But obviously not all economies are created equal. And we know that with like Bangladesh, some other countries that are like very big climate, abusers, I guess, they definitely need the money to switch their economies and things away from these really hurtful production processes, I guess. And we also know that, obviously, just to name the obvious, there's a lot of like economic abuses made by these countries that are causing deaths within their countries. So this is not just an issue for, like taking money away from like larger economies, but it's also for like the betterment of these countries. We know that, like in 2019, there was a study by Stanford Institute that found that within that increased inequality between economically developed and developing countries increased by 25% since 1960. And so because of that, there's actually going to be more kind of disagreements between developed countries and developed economies and those that like they want to help, even though they want to like kind of, take the money for their own economic benefits.
Interesting, huh? So it sounds like there's a lot of dispute with different types of economies and different types of nations in regards to the direction that COP26 sort of sent us along. But even from what a lot of other countries have said, even for nations that are relatively developed, or even for nations that are more environmentally conscious, there's also been a lot of pushback within those nations against the lack of progress that was seen as being made on other issues addressed by the COP26. So Eira, what sort of discussion has happened specifically in regards to deforestation in terms of what things the COP conference did not do a great job of handling?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to talk about sort of this developing country idea, because I noticed Marcus also mentioned that India was one of the countries that didn't sign the coal agreement. India also didn't sign the deforestation agreement. And I thought it was really interesting what Bodhi said about how developing countries need something to back them, because through all the research that I've done, one of the main criticisms has been that a lot of what the like donations and the funding that comes from country to country in regards to deforestation ends up being a lot of politics rather than like specifically helping the climate. So for example, I think it was in 2019, Norway was suspended funding for a certain Amazon fund to Brazil because there was an argument with Brazil's president. So I think it's like really disappointing that politics still takes precedent over like major issues like climate change. But for example, India, agriculture accounts for 15% of their economy. And so they need help backing and moving away from this like coal-based and this deforestation and land like abuse-based economy if they want to actually advance in any sense. And they haven't seen that like those endorsements and those donations that they need to do that. And a lot of it is based off of sort of like politics and Prime Minister Modi and how he's handling these situations. So that's been one of the major critiques for the deforestation side of it.
Interesting. And on the sort of other end, I assume sort of similar criticisms have also been levied. But on the coal end of things, or the fossil fuel end of things, Marcus, have similar accusations been sort of made, especially given that there's been a lot of protest against COP26, even while the discussions were ongoing in regards to sort of similar issues pertaining to coal consumption around the world?
Yeah, well, so there's been a few things that I personally see, but also other news outlets and such have pointed out as criticisms with regard to what was decided on coal. And they actually tie in a lot with some of the first things that I mentioned. So as I mentioned before, there was this big agreement that 190 countries signed. And as I mentioned before, the 4 countries that stayed out of that never signed that, were China, Japan, India, and the United States. And they together account for over 75% of global coal use. So any agreement that doesn't feature them is going to have relatively marginal impact, because even if all of those other 190 countries just like stopped using coal, that would only reduce total by 15%. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is China and the US did draw up their own agreement, as I mentioned before also. But one of the biggest things that was reported on this as being problematic is that China it's unclear, I think it was China, but a few countries were haggling over the language, and they actually changed it in the final draft versus the previous draft to, instead of being the wording of phasing out coal, China wanted it to be phased down. So, which kind of removes the possibility of eliminating it fully. And I know that sort of to us sounds like a really small thing, but to them that was a really major sticking point, and kind of disappointing, because it means that like it kind of shows the fact that they cared that much about a particular word is indicative of the fact that they might not be fully committed to the phasing out of coal, even in that separate agreement that they did. Now, another thing I wanted to mention was that I said before that this was the first COP conference that they actually explicitly mentioned a type of fossil fuel. In this case, it was coal, which to me almost seems weird. Like, you'd think that in the past 30 years of these things, something like that would have come up a little bit. So that's also strange. But then also, it's the only one they mentioned. They didn't talk at all about like oil or gas as problems. And in fact, Biden has publicly stated that he wants to increase oil production to lower the high oil costs that we've had. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there in sort of the lip service to the COP. I also wanted to touch on something similar to the fossil fuel thing, a little bit different than the coal, but some interesting statistics I found from globalwitness.org about something that hadn't been reported on a bunch, which was the presence of fossil fuel companies and lobbyists at this event. So in addition to the country's delegations that were present here, there was also representatives from like business and NGOs and other organizations at this event. And so there was 503 delegates from different fossil fuel companies there. And so that means that if they were all from different companies, but if they were all if we're considering them one fossil fuel delegation, they would have been by, I believe, like 24, the largest delegation there, larger than any other individual country. And then also, in addition, they would have been larger. This kind of ties into what Bodhi was talking about. They would be about twice as large as the official UN indigenous constituency that was represented there. And as well, they would have been larger than the combined total of 8 delegations from some of the countries that were worst affected by climate change. That is Puerto Rico, Myanmar, Haiti, the Philippines, Mozambique, Bahamas, Pakistan, and as Bodhi mentioned before, Bangladesh. So it's frustrating because it's like, it's going to be really hard to imagine any kind of radical change happening when you've got that level of entrenchment of fossil fuel interests at an event that's supposed to be about climate change, in particular in comparison to the interests of the countries that are, as Bodhi was talking about, are probably going to be most affected by the negative effects. So that's sort of some of the main criticisms that have been leveled at it in regard to its effectiveness. The other major thing I just wanted to touch on, I know I've been talking for a little while, but the other thing is just like all of the agreements here, some of them have actual mechanisms in terms to try to like keep countries to it, but a lot of it is voluntary. Like countries can sign it without having to necessarily do it. And so that's just something to keep in mind as you hear news about these types of UN conferences, that countries sometimes agree to things that they don't necessarily end up following through on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's certainly, I think, one of the main issues that a lot of people have targeted towards COP26, the fact that it might make meaningful strides, but a lot of it is just language without any tangible action. So just sort of in conclusion, I'm kind of curious to hear what your folks' takes are in terms of the path moving forward and sort of what the future might look like in regards to what COP26 will do more generally to affect the environment and how future climate conferences and summits might look like. So Bodhi, kind of thoughts of the future, where we sort of head after COP26?
Yeah, so I think that since COP26 is one of the first that we've had where there's kind of been a lot of interest groups, like Marcus was saying, it's kind of, it foreshadows a lot of future summits and a lot of future decisions made by the UN Climate Change Council. We see that in a lot of ways that because of COP26, there's a lot of like discussions being made like within certain governments on like kind of a regional scale, but not kind of coherent decisions made by several countries. And so because of that, I think that it like kind of brings out a lot of it brings out kind of decisions to be made for like future years based on like economies within countries, but there's not going to be a lot of kind of like similar decisions made by several countries or several developed economies, and in a lot of ways I think that again, like Marcus was saying, and I touched on that in my first speech, I guess. But there was a lot of kind of, again, neglection of these small countries. And because of that, especially with these island nations that have, rising sea levels, and I think it was Tuvalu that the leader kind of stood on a podium in the middle of the water and he said, "This is my country," right? So it's a lot of kind of that, and how like we're not really paying attention to the immediate effects that we need to focus on. And so I think that within future climate conferences, we need to focus more on like the immediate effects, not more on like the potential effects that are going to obviously affect more like developed countries, developed economies, and that could, potentially change the global economy, global trade, and production. So that's where I stand. I think that it's a lot of, again, just kind of talk. I think that it's a lot, especially within countries that are on the UN Climate Council. So, the US, namely, that we're sort of leading the way to this future of stopping climate change. But at the same time, it's more like within the US, this is what we're going to do. And we don't really care about what they do unless we're in a conference and we have to say something.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Eira, other sort of related thoughts in terms of what the path forward looks like?
Yeah, so like what Bodhi was saying about the US, I think that the biggest issue is just that like we need a lot of the big countries to come together and actually do something. And what we're seeing is that they're like split on these minor issues, like the US didn't sign the coal one, and the US and I think China didn't sign the coal agreement. And so if you don't have these big countries actually banding together and making moves, any small country that's like trying to do something or actually like following through on what they promised can't create that amount of change. And so the biggest issue is just that we don't have the time now to wait for these countries to start doing something, right? When we see that like we're just now getting to singling out coal. That should have happened like years ago, right? We should have already been there. We should have already been making moves. So the fact that we're getting so close to these deadlines, like 2030, it was supposed to be reducing carbon emissions, and everyone's just sort of like it'll happen, like we're signing things, we're doing things, but no one's actually changing anything. So unless countries start actually following through and we have some way to police them and make sure that they follow through, I don't think that we're going to see as much change as the COP26 has promised.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of international climate activists in particular agree with you on that point. Marcus, kind of to conclude our general thoughts on path forward, what are you thinking about in terms of the future and what COP26 has done, either for the better or for the worse, in terms of what the future will look like vis-a-vis climate change?
I mean, I agree with a lot of what Bodhi and Eira said. I think that there is a tendency, because the large countries like China and the US have they have a very large ability when they're at these things to kind of take the stage and set the tone and what the messaging of the event is. I think they have a tendency to kind of evade blame on themselves. Like they tend to put it on the smaller countries and the countries that sure are more reliant on coal, but their total coal actual use, because they're smaller, is like pales in comparison to that of the larger countries. And so I think, I'm not a scientist and I don't know if the numbers would work out, but the way I see it, like if we were really able to get, the big four coal producers to seriously mitigate that 75% that they use, it would honestly probably be okay for some developing countries to continue to use coal until their technologies and industries are able to develop such that they are not as reliant on it. I think the burden needs to be on those who are doing the most production. And at the moment, that is the countries, that are the big four emitters, including the US. And I think for us as people living here, we do have sort of a responsibility to try and do what we can to push our government officials to be more accountable on that, since we have the opportunity as, being here to influence our government. So that's something that I've definitely taken away from the research that we did on this, and I'll try to bring forward in the things I choose to advocate for.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Marcus. And thanks so much, everyone, for, I think it was a really, really interesting and helpful discussion about COP26, the good, the bad, and everything within, sort of in between, so to speak. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the future with regards to climate change. It's obviously one of the defining issues that our generation is currently facing and will continue to face into the future. So thanks so much, everyone, for watching, and have a fantastic day. Make sure to subscribe to Instagram. It's fantastic.